The family waited one day and then another. They spent the time relaxing, sipping tea, and contemplating the crackling fire as storm breezes quivered its flame. Only the gusting wind and the occasional boom of thunder interrupted their conversations. Justin tossed a twig into the fire. "Rain or not, tomorrow we head out." There was no comment from either Michelle or Paul. Justin continued, "There's plenty of jerky and nuts. I think of that as our emergency supply." Paul's eyes shifted to Michelle. "We could get lucky and find something fast. The rain will help." Justin settled back in his chair. Paul's words reassured him, and he drifted into quiet thought, his eyes closed. The sound of the trickling rain at the cave entrance reminded him of his beloved Oregon. He put his hands behind his head and pondered. All those people dead. I wonder how long Zoe lasted. The cave lit white with a flash of lightning, and thunder reverberated up the canyon. Justin drifted into a dream state, where he watched the Orca as she crossed over the bar and motored toward the bay. He could hear the heavy rumble of her husky diesel engine and felt the security it projected. There's nothing like a diesel engine. He saw himself tie the boat to the dock and shut the engine down. Suddenly, he was driving the old pickup home. How nice. How comfortable. Michelle got up. "This party's too much for me. I'm going to bed." She limped to the back of the cave. "I said I'm going to bed." Justin's eyes blinked. "Oh, good night, Michelle." Paul grumbled. Yeah, me too." He squirmed in his chair and fell back into sleep. Justin resumed his fantasy. The contentment of those days was like warm feet. Yes, like warm feet. I hate cold feet. He snorted when the wind drove a bit of fire smoke into the cave. A warm fire, the kids gone, a shot of brandy. Thunder rolled by the cave like cascading boulders. Justin ignored the rumbles. Transition, a world in transformation, and we get to see it. Why, I wonder, why? The rain poured with increased intensity. Justin slumbered into a deeper state. He found himself at sea, leaning over the side of the Orca, his head immersed in a turbulent sea on a black night. Unlike the surface, all below was quiet, calm, and shimmered with strange clarity, somehow disconnected from his eyes. Far below, something huge materialized. A wind of heat swirled through the sea and swept into his mind. A soft female voice whispered in his ear, "I love you." As the thing below rose, a strange heat warmed his mind further, and the temperature increased as the thing neared. Again the female voice whispered, "Sweetness the true, we fly." The thing from below dimmed to invisibility, and Justin pulled his head from the water. His chest swelled with a mighty breath, and he expelled his physical self onto the sea, where a small whirlpool sucked it down. Bodiless, his mind beheld the violent sea, and a mountain of a wave rose before him. A female form burst through the crown of the giant swell. She hovered there, glowing in the night air. What was left of Justin slid up the surface of the swell and joined the female at the crest. She looked at Justin with a mischievous smile and extended her right hand, revealing a large gray-black pearl. "For you, my love." The woman looked into the night sky, as did Justin, and they spiraled upward in a trail of little sparkling things. The female voice spoke a last time. It is done. The storm moved on during the night. Justin still slumbered in his chair. Michelle restarted the fire earlier, and water bubbled with herbs in a small pot. She touched her father's leg. "Dad, Dad, it's time to get up." His eyes opened to a sunshine-lit cave. He smiled. "I feel so rested." He swung his legs to the ground and stood up. He looked at Paul's chair and then at his bed. His son hoisted his bow. "Hi, Pop. Ready for the hunt?" "Yeah, let's eat something quick and head out." Michelle added a pinch of mint to the hot water. "Would you guys get me some more wood before you go?" She gave Paul a stern look. "I just want to be sure there's enough." Paul left his bed and put down his bow. "No problem." He picked up the axe and headed out of the cave. As Justin followed, he turned to Michelle. "I guess breakfast will be jerky and nuts." He turned away and then turned back. "We'll take some with us." In less than an hour the men returned, sweating and breathing heavily. Only Paul carried wood, a small amount. He threw it in the corner and picked up the water bag. Justin went directly to the fire. He scattered the coals and stomped the flames. Paul gulped some of the water and started sprinkling the fire. Michelle turned to her father. "What's up?" Justin stepped back from the fire. "There's a bunch of goons near the mouth of the canyon." Paul took another long gulp of water and put it down. "They probably won't be there long. We're going to have to stay put a bit longer." Michelle sat back in her chair. "I think I may be fit to walk in a day or so." Justin went to the foodstuff at the back of the cave. "We can have a small fire tonight, but it has to be very small and here at the back of the cave. Just to cook our last rabbit. No fire in the daytime." He came back and sat in his chair. "And we should keep our voices down as well." Paul went to his chair, sat down, and grabbed a piece of rabbit jerky. "They'll be gone in a day. There's nothing here for them." The next day the goons still camped at the canyon mouth. A few of them passed close to the cave in the early morning. The family heard them coming and quickly gathered their weapons. Michelle stood near Justin, peering down into the canyon. "Filthy things," she uttered. Justin nudged her with an elbow. "Quiet." The goons turned about and headed away. The family retreated back into the cave, placing their weapons near their chairs as they sat down. Michelle grumbled, "Why don't we go after them? We could hit them from 3 sides." She looked at her father. "They'll run for it." Justin gave her a stern look. "Your plan would probably work, but we're not going to kill if we don't have to." With a huff, Michelle sat back in her chair. Justin's stare continued. "They're humans." Paul sat up straight. "We could do what we did in Oregon." He paused, waiting for them to remember. "You know, make a lot of noise, bark like dogs, make them think there's 100 of us." Justin studied the cave ceiling. "We have time. We can wait a bit more. No need to look for trouble." Near dark, they heard the first howls of the dogs. Justin rose out of his chair and went to the entrance of the cave. Another dog howled. He turned toward the sound. "They're after the goons." He came back into the cave. "I'm going to make a fire." He frowned as he walked to the woodpile. "Closer to the entrance, a small one." He picked up a few branches. "Those poor suckers don't have fire, and not much for weapons." A surge of pity bowed Justin's head as he conjured an image of the pitiful creatures huddled together unprotected, knowing that soon the dogs would come. He added a few larger branches to the stack cradled in his left arm, and with his head still bowed, he walked to the cave entrance in thought. We could help them. He turned to his children, his mouth open as if to say something. Paul waited, and then spoke. What? Justin blinked. Nothing. He dropped the wood. It sounds like a large pack. Periodic barks and howls continued. Justin whittled on wood. Paul cycled between fiddling with his weapons and playing with the fire. Michelle talked almost continuously, trying to extort conversation from the stoic men. Her words had little meaning, and were ignored. When the light of the moon glared, the dogs' howling intensified, making sleep impossible. Justin studied the stick he'd been whittling on. It portrayed nothing, and he threw it into the fire. The man stood and walked to the cave entrance. He bowed his head. Damn this stuff. He raised his head. I wish we could shut it out. Paul and Michelle sat quietly in their chairs. Their father, his head bowed, sank to his knees and then to his bottom. He rested his back against the side of the hill. The clamoring of the dogs ceased. Michelle went to the fire and knelt on one knee. The bottom of the small pit was covered with glowing coals, and small bits of wood added little flames here and there. Calmly, with a short stick, she pushed the bits of wood into a small pile at the center. The flames intensified with the gathering. I prefer the dogs. A short moment later a human scream sliced its way up the canyon and rushed into the cave. Michelle's back stiffened. She shuddered, and the stick dropped from her hand. A brief moment of silence passed while Michelle stood up and took a deep breath. Paul covered his ears with his hands. Justin moved from the entrance and returned to his seat. Michelle stared into the night and listened to a different sound, the sound of someone or something running up the canyon. A moment later a husky voice yelled, "Mow me! Mow me!" It was clear and near. A dog growled. A human screamed in pain. "No! No! Mow me! Mow me!" Justin tried cupping his ears, to no avail. All three heard the struggling of the human, his grunts telling of his efforts, his screams telling of his failures. After long minutes, the man gurgled his last, "Mow me, mow." Justin's face contorted as he stood up and rushed to the back of the cave. He stood there, confused, looking from place to place. He picked a corner and crumpled into it. There would be similar sounds as the night dripped slowly by. The animals were unskilled in killing humans, and their methods were slow and sloppy. Paul jumped to his feet. "I can't bear this." He ran to the cave entrance. "Let that be the last." And then he whispered, "No more. No more." Michelle scuffled to her father's side with tear-laden eyes. She huddled near him. Justin whispered, "This is a bad thing." He paused. "Don't get lost in this. Don't get lost." Through the night, the ugly sounds continued and were duplicated by canyon echoes. Michelle struggled to her feet and stepped to her brother. She swallowed and wiped her eyes. "We can make a psychic effort to end this horror." She straightened and took a deep breath. "Let them have death. Let them be free of pain." She poked Paul with her right hand. "We can do this. We can help." Paul never raised his head. "You do it yourself." Michelle ran to her bed and sobbed. Paul spun toward her. "This is what you wanted." Justin's hand went to his temples. Don't! Say no more. You're making more pain for later." Michelle's sobbing ceased, and only her occasional cough was heard. From time to time she shivered beneath her cover. The night ended, and so did the carnage. When the sun rose with warm brightness, Paul and Justin ventured out to determine the situation. They found a high perch with a clear view of the canyon entrance and the flat plain that extended down away from it. At the entrance, only one dog sniffed about. With no other sign of life, Justin raised his field glasses and scanned the flat plain. "There they are. They're moving to the west." The bulk of the dog pack strolled behind the humans at a leisurely matched pace, a forsaken sight of predatory horror. Justin handed the glasses to Paul. He put them to his eyes for a moment and handed them back to his father. "The dogs are following them." Justin put the glasses back in his pocket. "Their bellies are full." He took a deep breath. "For now." Paul watched the lone dog as it trotted toward the rest of the pack. "Perhaps Michelle had the right idea." He turned to his father. "We could have killed them all. Killed them in a better way." Justin was unmoved. "No, we did the right thing." He turned and spoke over his shoulder. "We can only do what we think is right." He sighed. "Even if it turns out to be wrong." Paul spoke to his father's back. "I'm drained. This pathetic shit gets to me." The family, weary from the lack of sleep and emotional strain, rested through the day. They gave Michelle a simple report that the danger had passed and that tomorrow they would go on a hunt. She sought no other information. The next day the men made quick preparations for the hunt and stood by, ready to leave. The dangers of most concern for Michelle had come and gone. Nevertheless, the men stacked extra wood and some green brush. The brush would burn with a lot of smoke and act as a distress signal. Michelle deployed her weapons strategically and set the makings for additional fires at the entrance. Justin turned to Michelle. "Well, we're off. You all set?" "I guess, but I don't like this." Paul put an arm around her. "We won't be long." He kissed her on the cheek and headed out of the cave. Michelle watched as the only two people in her life made their exit and disappeared around the corner of the cave. She put her hands on her hips and turned slowly while inspecting the empty cave. She ended the rotation at the cave opening and gawked at the bright light of the day. After a long moment she stepped softly to her chair and flopped into it, her fingers running through her long hair. "Shit. I'm not going to wait more than 2 days. 1.5. Her body gave a sudden, short shiver. She took a breath and fixed her attention on the strands of dried grass beside her chair, the makings for a basket, but she didn't touch them. A few moments later she looked at the pile of firewood. "A small fire will do." She turned toward her weapons. "What good will they be in the dark?" Long moments passed in cool, rock-hard silence. Michelle's gaze fixed on the entrance, and her eyelids hung half-closed. A short shudder passed up her left arm, across her shoulder, and dissipated with 3 short blinks of her eyes. Moments expanded into minutes. Michelle sucked a deep breath. "Like the night before." She jumped to her feet. "It's not going to happen to me." She rechecked her weapons. The arrows were ready. The blowgun lay with a dart in its chamber and others placed for easy reach. She strapped on both knives, one to her right calf and one to her left calf. She took the vial of poison from her backpack and dipped all the darts. She pinned one dart just above her breast. This will be my last escape. Michelle spent the entire day in restless motion. She cleaned the cave twice and adjusted the weapons numerous times. Often her own voice broke the silence with curses directed at Paul and Justin. Never again. Never again. In the end she returned to her chair, sat down, took a deep breath, and reached for the strands of grass at her feet. Justin and Paul traveled north at a moderate, constant pace. They moved cautiously, zigzagging, covering a lot of ground. Gone for 4 hours, a direct trip back required only 1 hour. The men emerged from a grove of trees and stood before a field of sunburned grass with a steep knoll at the center. Defensively crouched and hanging back in the shade, they examined the terrain before them. Silently, the pair moved out onto the grass. The sun streamed hot rays in contrast to the cool shade of the trees. All was quiet, with the exception of a few buzzing insects. Abruptly, Paul stopped. He grabbed his father by the shoulder. Justin halted. Paul held one finger to his lips. Apprehensive moments passed. Paul held an upright palm to Justin and took a few more steps up the knoll. Another moment passed, and he signaled Justin to move next to him. The first growling sounds were now audible to Justin as well. A yelp and then a high-pitched bark resounded from the top of the hill. How many dogs were there, and could they be eliminated? Justin reached over his shoulder and pulled the blowgun from his pack. He placed it in his left hand against the stock of his compound bow. Arrows were at the ready in their quiver. The men, thus prepared, headed for the top of the knoll. Near the crest they halted to listen again. The sounds were louder and no longer muffled. The men, horizontal, their bellies to the earth, concentrated on the din flowing over the knoll. Flying insects buzzed. The sun baked droplets of sweat from their skin. Paul raised 4 fingers. In truth, he guessed only 3, but added 1 for safety. Justin concurred. The dogs growled in low, constant tones, indicating they were probably feeding, and more importantly, preoccupied. Justin touched his son and pointed to his own eyes. Paul nodded. The men crept through the dry grass to a position close to the top of the knoll. With weapons ready, the hunters rose in unison, but only as high as necessary to make an assessment of the situation. There were 3 dogs, all feeding. The animal's meal was a young girl, in pieces, and the grass was blotched crimson with her blood. A large yellow dog gripped the girl's ribs in its mouth and dragged the upper torso about. Her long black hair and one remaining arm trailed behind. Her eyes, wide open, but dead, bulged from a face frozen in a look of disbelief. The lower half of her body occupied the attention of another beast feasting on internal organs. This dog, a female, swallowed large chunks in rapid succession. Near some brush, the third dog pulled a thigh muscle free from a lily-white bone. Both men dropped from sight. Paul lay with his face close to the ground and uttered a short staccato of sound. Ah, ah, ah. Justin, his face close to Paul's, whispered, "We'll take the close dogs first. You take the one to your left, and I'll take the one to my right. Do it fast and get back down." Justin allowed his son a moment. "Get ready." Paul nodded. The men shifted their bows, put an arrow in place, and laid the weapons before them. They pulled the sheathed, broad-blade knives and stabbed them into the ground. Justin drew his blowgun, and his fingers tapped the weapon as if it were a flute. Paul placed his pouch of spare darts near the knives and hoisted his blowgun. The blowguns were quickly loaded. Justin, using silent finger movements, counted to 3. The men once again rose in unison. They located the targets, and the deadly missiles were sent on their way. The action was so quick that the men were concealed before the darts struck. The 2 dogs targeted jumped and yelped at the sting of the needles. One beast contorted to reach the projectile, and with snapping teeth it pulled the object from its flank, but the poison was in, and the animal doomed. The dart that struck the other dog penetrated deeply, numbing the wound. The action didn't escape the attention of the 3rd dog. Even before the darts were fired, her sharp instincts signaled trouble. She swallowed the flesh in her mouth, and her tongue licked her jowls. With eyes steadied, she trotted toward the crest. After 3 strides, the figures of 2 men appeared. She froze in place. Suddenly, the vision in one eye vanished, and the animal's brain exploded in pain. The beast leaped into the air and wildly pawed at its eye, while another dart pushed deep into her neck, tainting the blood rushing to her brain. Only moments of her life remained. Justin and Paul understood the science of the poison and stood their ground, observing and reloading their blowguns. Justin pointed to the last dog as it fell to its side, twitching. With a sudden movement, the men crouched into a defensive posture. To their right, loud thrashing sounds emanated from the brush. Fear gripped their stomachs. How many dogs were coming? Had they guessed wrong? Each man felt his pouch containing the spare darts. They knew the count, but they still counted. To their astonishment, a woman broke free of the brush. She ran, or more precisely, hobbled, toward the dying dogs, toting a large stick in a determined attack. 1 dog lay dead. The other 2, in a drugged stupor, stood on wobbling legs, watching the advancing woman. Justin pushed to his full height and shouted, "Stay back! Stay back!" He tried to wave her off, but the woman paid no heed and moved without distraction. Paul stood and added his voice to the warning, "Stay back! Stay back!" The woman raised her club and continued her advance. Justin took a step to run down and physically restrain her when yet another commotion came from the right. From the same bush that the woman had dashed, a large, muscular dog appeared. The beast, like the woman, moved with obvious intention. Automatically, both men lifted their blowguns to their mouths, took aim, and fired. Both darts hit the dog, one in the chest and one in the rump. Undeterred from his one-minded pursuit, the dog continued the attack. Justin and Paul reached for their bows. Justin raised his first, just as the black beast pounced. The dog's large paws, studded with hook-like claws grown sharp in soft soil, penetrated the softness of the woman's shoulders. The strike of the animal, also a push, drove her forward and off her feet. Lacerating claws tore her shirt, tore her skin, tore her muscles, and scored her bones. Blood of the daughter and blood of the mother colored the grass. The dog's paws gripped the small of the woman's back, and his eyes widened with the anticipated kill. Strands of sparkling silver oozed from his jaws, and the loose skin around his mouth curled, exposing large, brilliant white incisors. To effect the kill, the beast thrust his head down, his upper fangs puncturing the woman's left cheek, dislodging one of her teeth and tearing her tongue. The animal's lower fangs dug into a soft spot at the base of her skull and to the right of the second vertebrae. Powerful jaw muscles contracted with the ability to crumble the vertebrae and sever the delicate nerves within. At that precise moment, a heavy arrow from Justin's bow struck. It smashed through the dog's skull, destroying the small primitive brain. In a spasm of death, the beast jerked its head up, tearing the flesh of the face and neck. The dog fell on top of the woman. The men rushed to her. Chapter 14. Skinning the Soul. Justin and Nicole. Justin and Paul, in a coordinated pace, rushed across the rough terrain with the form of a dark-haired woman. Unconscious, twitching, she moaned, "Julia, Shmaine." The men's sweat mingled with blood as they strained with the dying burden. Half her face ripped into ugliness, and the other half soft beauty. Blood and dirt spattered a firm, well-shaped body, heavy for its size. The men pushed hard, and their chests heaved. As they neared the cave, Justin took the woman's entire weight and instructed Paul. "Go." He took a deep breath. "Tell Michelle to prepare." Paul ran ahead. Justin struggled with each step. A few moments later, gasping for air, he stopped and leaned on a large, sun-warmed boulder. The woman's head hung back. Her breathing gurgled with oozing blood. Justin hunched forward and moved from the rock. He struggled another minute or two and found yet another stone to lean against. He thought of setting the woman down, but to his relief he heard the noise of Paul's return. Paul jumped from a stone and landed near Justin. "Michelle's getting things ready. Here's a drink." He set the water bag down, took the woman from his father, and walked toward the cave. Justin gulped water, allowing some to run over his chest. His hands dropped to his knees, and he took a few deep breaths. A moment later he straightened and caught up to Paul. "Put her down and we'll each take an arm and a leg." With the maneuver completed, Paul looked at Justin. "Do you think she's a goon?" Justin hesitated and shook his head. "No, she didn't behave like one." Paul sucked in a deep breath. "I scared the shit out of Michelle." He groaned and stepped over a log. "The blood." When the men entered the cave, Michelle directed them to Justin's bed. The exhausted men laid the woman down and backed away. Michelle whistled at the sight of the woman's wounds. She began to pour water across her back. Justin spoke between gulps of water, giving Michelle an account of what happened. He placed the water bag near Michelle. "I think there's others." She called out names. Michelle picked at pieces of grass and dirt. "Are they goons?" "I don't think so." He paused. "I'm going to have to take Paul with me." Michelle poured more water over Nicole's wounds. "Okay, I'll see what I can do." Justin lingered. "Do you need something before we go?" Michelle held 2 fingers to Nicole's neck. "Her pulse feels strong. Perhaps she didn't lose that much blood." Her voice cracked. "No, but hurry back." She looked at her father. "I'll try to stop the bleeding." Justin backed away, turned, waved at Paul, and exited the cave. Michelle poured disinfectant into some water and sprinkled it over Nicole's back. "Tell me you're not a goon." Nicole moaned. "Shmaine, no, no." Michelle studied the left side of Nicole's face. "There's gonna be scars." She reached for the suturing kit. "It's time for the needlework." She leaned close to Nicole's ear. "I'm going to start with your back. Try not to move, and put the pain out of your mind." She pulled separated tissue together and began suturing. It took close to an hour to completely close the lacerations. Michelle, kneeling before Nicole, sat back on her heels. "Your back wounds are closed." She washed Nicole's back again and sprinkled more disinfectant. "It looks okay." She studied Nicole's torn face. Her cheek was split to the back of her jaw. 2 dislodged teeth and the damaged tongue were visible. The bleeding was slight and mixed with saliva. Michelle poked at the broken teeth with a pair of tweezers. She looked up to the cave ceiling. "I can do this." She took a deep breath and returned to her task. As Michelle nervously attended to Nicole's wounds, Justin and Paul stared at the bloody mess at the grassy knoll. Justin turned away and gulped a breath of air. "Retrieve your weapons, the darts if you can." Paul, his face pale, made no reply. Justin pointed to the north. "Let's see if we can follow her trail through that brush." After about 100 yards, Justin stopped and shouted, "Shemaine! Julia!" He turned to Paul. "Keep your bow at the ready." Paul pulled an arrow from his quiver. "I don't think we should push it. We could be setting ourselves up for a bunch of goons, or more dogs." Justin bit his lip. "Dogs, maybe, but I don't think goons. She acted different. A goon would have run off." Justin wiped his brow. "But it's hard to be sure about dogs or goons." He paused. "Okay, you move 30 yards to my left. Let me do the shouting. Make it look like I'm alone." Paul took 2 steps to his left and turned back. "How long do we do this?" He looked at his son. "Not very long." Paul disappeared into the brush. Justin waited a few moments and then shouted, "Shemaine! Julia!" Shemaine stood with folded arms at the spot where her mother entered the brush. Behind her the fires crackled. She turned and walked to the center of the clearing, head down. In a sudden move she straightened and turned. Her eyes squinted, and she remained still for several moments. Finally she let out an exasperated breath and walked to each fire and poked at them with a stick. Eventually she found herself back at the same spot, staring in the direction her mother had gone. A moment later the sound of her name drifted ghostly through the air. Her brow furrowed, and she heard Julia's name. She wrapped her arms around her stomach and quivered. A voice repeated her name, and then Julia's. She stiffened. Her hesitation lasted only a few seconds. She faced the sound and cupped her hands at her mouth. "Over here! Over here!" She waited and shouted louder. "Over here! I'm over here!" Justin turned his head. "Paul, get over here." In a few moments Paul came crashing through the brush. Justin pointed. "There, somewhere to our right. I'll go ahead. You stay out of sight and back me up." Paul nodded in agreement. "It sounds like a young girl." Ten minutes later, Justin stood before Shemaine. She stood back from him, a spear held by both hands. Justin spoke in a low voice. "We can help. Are you Shemaine?" She said nothing. "Then you must be Julia." He turned to face the bush. "Paul, come on in. It's okay." Shemaine relaxed a bit, stood more erect, and shifted the spear to one hand. "Have you seen my mother? My sister?" Justin hesitated and then replied somberly, "Your mother's badly hurt, but she's with my daughter and being tended to." His expression softened. "Your sister is dead." Shemaine crumbled to her knees. "Oh, no. Please, God, no." Justin surveyed the camp. "This is not a safe place." He looked down at her. "We should go now." He reached to help her to her feet. "Julia, it's best we leave now." Shemaine murmured, "I'm Shemaine." Her eyes streamed tears. "Do you have any things to take?" She pointed to a bush. "Over there. 3 packs." Paul came into the camp. He looked at the distressed girl, then at his father. Justin's face strained as he turned to Paul. "No need to linger here." He pointed to his left. "Get their stuff behind that bush." Paul hesitated. Shemaine stood next to Justin, her head down and her face covered with both hands. Justin explained. "The girl was her sister, and the woman is her mother. This is Shemaine." After extinguishing the fires, they headed back to the cave with Justin in front, Shemaine in the middle, and Paul behind. They circumnavigated the carnage at the knoll. With concentrated effort and no conversation, they were soon standing at the cave entrance. Shemaine spotted Nicole and rushed to her side. She sucked in a breath at the sight of her mother's wounds. She sank to her knees and implored, "Let me help. I know some medicine, and there's supplies in our packs." The hard look on Michelle's face relaxed, and she sat back on her haunches. "You know her?" "Oh, yes. She's my mother." Michelle straightened up. "You can wash the wounds on her back. That powder is disinfectant. Sprinkle it around. Mix it with the water." This process took time. Nicole lay still, and her breathing was rhythmic. In due course, all that could be done had been done. Michelle stood, went to the cave entrance, and faced a southerly breeze. Shemaine reclined near her mother. Her eyes closed, and her right forearm rested across them. The men, though tired, still had the difficult task of dealing with the remains of the young girl. Justin approached Michelle and whispered, "We have to take care of her sister's remains." Michelle turned and sighed. "Okay, but why are they here? It hasn't been our way." Justin shrugged. "It just kind of happened." Michelle bowed her head and her voice cracked. "Obviously they're not goons. Are they?" Justin put an arm around her. No, they're not." He squeezed her with his right arm. "You did a great job on the woman. I'm proud of you." He kissed her on the forehead and released his grip. Justin turned and signaled Paul, who walked to the entrance. "Nice work, sis." He put his hand on her shoulder and gave it a little squeeze. Justin stepped out of the cave, and Paul followed. The men completed their burial chore with a small grave of piled stones. They left the site exhausted and without words. They hoisted their weapons and walked back to the cave, stopping once at a small stream to clean themselves. Paul splashed water on his face. "That was ugly." Justin rubbed his closed eyes. "Beyond words." A vision of Nicole running at the killers of her daughter passed through his mind. He looked at Paul and murmured a silent plea. "Please, not me. Please." The following days passed slowly. Nicole's condition intensified when infection set in. Her facial wounds swelled, making her incapable of speech. Mostly she drifted in a state of semi-consciousness. Shemaine stayed close and used her knowledge of herbs to treat the infection. Justin briefed Shemaine on the events at the knoll, certain of the need for the information when her mother revived. Shemaine wept the entire time. After the young girl absorbed the initial shock of the story, she returned to her mother's side. Justin watched both of them for several minutes before walking over to Shemaine. He squatted in front of her and spoke softly. "Where did you come from?" The young girl looked at him with watery eyes. We came from the north." She waved her hand as if annoyed. "A settlement of people. Ravens in the sky." She sniffed. Her head slowly lowered as if pushed by a weight. "A bunch of crazy people killed everybody." She looked up again. "Except for us." She wiped her cheeks with the back of her hands. "We headed south. We're special people." The words mixed with sudden sobs, and her body trembled. Justin rose to a standing position. "Rest. This place is safe." He studied the girl for a moment and walked away. A day later, Nicole awakened with a moan, but didn't open her eyes. Pain burned through her body, and a few muscles on her back quivered. Shemaine at her side whispered in her ear, "It's me, Shemaine. We're in a safe place." To Nicole, the voice echoed as if spoken through a pipe. She could only open her right eye to blurry images and shapes of black and white. Shemaine spoke again. "Can you take some water?" The words were incomprehensible to Nicole, and she closed her eye to ugly images of bloody grass and a dog-faced girl that snarled and snapped inches from her face. She passed into blackness. "Mother? Mother?" There was no response. Days later, the somber mood of the cave-dwellers continued. The sun hovered at its high point, and the people rested after a noon meal. Paul and Justin reclined in their chairs. Nicole slept on Justin's bed. Shemaine leaned against the cave entrance, and Michelle sat across from her. A friendly relationship developed, and they spent much time chatting. "Your mother's a lot better." Shemaine blinked slowly. "Oh, yeah. A lot of that bright redness around the wounds is gone." Her eyes closed. Michelle scribbled with a twig in the dirt. "I'm sorry about your sister." Shemaine sighed and massaged her temples. "I miss her." She took another deep breath. "Our family is getting so small." Michelle dropped the stick. "I lost my brother back in Oregon." She bit her lip. "His name was David. Some trees fell on him." Long moments passed in silence until Nicole coughed. Shemaine turned and watched. Nicole sat up and took a drink of water from an old tin can that Paul had found recently. She turned to Michelle as Nicole lay back on the bed. "I was sitting here the other day, and I saw my sister." She pointed to a group of trees in the canyon. "Right over there." She smiled, waved, and walked away. Michelle turned toward the trees. "Have you told your mother?" Shemaine shrugged. "Later, maybe." She looked at Michelle and smiled. "But it was nice." She put her face into the sun. "It's a good thing you found us. Probably would have been the end." She paused. Perhaps that would have been better. I am so tired of all this. Michelle rose to her feet. My father says things happen the way they're supposed to. Shemaine looked up at her. And what does that mean? Michelle eyed Shemaine and smirked. It means all of life is good and there is no bad. Shemaine blinked. No bad? Michelle smiled. Yeah, you got it. Her head tilted to one side. There's a lot more to it than that. She leaned toward Shemaine, her eyebrows up. Sometimes it even makes sense to me. Shemaine shook her head. I'll never see the good of this stuff. It's a whole lot of pain and wasted time. Michelle spoke as she walked away. Guess what? Before Shemaine could reply, Michelle responded. Rabbit for dinner. Michelle twirled in a full turn. Big surprise, huh? The first light of the following morning streamed through a veil of smoke issuing from a half-burned branch at the fire's edge. Nicole lay with her eyes open, intrigued by the slow, graceful movement of the smolder. She reclined on her side, her hands folded as if in prayer, tucked beneath her head. She yearned to pull her legs up, but hot pain ran down her back. A tear rolled across the bridge of her nose. Her tongue investigated the extensive wounds within her mouth. She found a tender spot and pushed with her tongue. Her eyes closed to the pain, and she moaned when she tasted blood. A muscle in Nicole's back twitched. You again. She pushed her legs as straight as she could, and from her waist down she rolled to her back as her left hand slowly slid across her body and dropped behind her back. Positioned palm down, it held her back off the cot and allowed her hips to roll. The torment of the twitch contorted Nicole's face. Muscles pulled on unhealed wounds, and warm blood trickled down her back. She took a breath and held it. The cramps relaxed almost instantly. The quick recovery, a shock in itself, made Nicole expel a long sigh, and she moved her left hand back to her front. Julia, forgive me. Nicole closed her eyes. Then she saw Michelle walk over to Paul. Paul, we need more wood. We have to keep this place warmer. Paul smirked. Sure, we can do that. He turned to his father. We have to start bringing in more wood. Keep this place warmer. His eyebrows went up. So says Michelle. Justin grinned. Well, let's go do it. He put a hand on his son's shoulder. It's better than just sitting here watching her fuss with this and that. The men walked to their weapons. Justin put his hand on Paul's shoulder. This is a first for you, isn't it? What do you mean, a first? Well, functioning to supply the needs of the women folk. He picked up his bow. It's an ancient thing. Prehistoric, in fact. He stood up. It's because we have bigger muscles. Michelle listened to every word. The men walked toward the cave entrance, and Justin turned to Michelle. We're headed out to get some more wood. Keep this place warmer. He looked at Paul. I just accepted the responsibility to increase the wood flow. Paul smiled. I guess we're back to the prehistoric. Like they say, son, history repeats itself. Michelle watched them, half smiling and half grimacing. Paul turned and spoke to Shemaine. Need any herbs or something? Michelle mimicked his words. Need any herbs or something? Michelle stood between the two. Shemaine answered Paul. No, nothing. but thanks for asking." She smiled. Paul lifted a finger in Michelle's direction. A few days later, Justin sat near the cave entrance, scraping a rabbit hide. Shemaine walked past him on her way to meet Paul at the base of the canyon. They were out to set a few traps and gather some herbs for tea. Michelle spun around to see her father gazing at the young woman as she walked away. "Pretty, isn't she? And so very young." Justin turned and frowned, but a moment later laughed. Michelle ambled up close to him and spoke in a low tone. "You're leering." Justin maintained his smile. "You're being absurd." His brow wrinkled. "Beauty is beauty. What's with the leering comment?" Michelle's scowl suddenly softened, and her shoulders slumped. "I don't know." She leaned against the cave wall. "Life has gotten so strange." She looked directly into his eyes. "What if we're here till we die?" Justin melted as his little girl's eyes welled with tears. He put his arm around her. "That won't happen. But I know what you mean." He tugged on her shoulder. "I've got a good feeling about the future. We'll find that place. Things won't be as they were, but I think they'll be just as good." He waited. Michelle wiped the tears from her cheeks, walked over to her chair and sat down, and gazed at the outside world. Justin exhausted a deep breath, and he whispered to himself, "Never the chance to be a woman." His voice boomed. "We're close. I know it." Michelle's right arm rose in the air and waved a dreary acknowledgment. Justin saw Nicole sitting up. He walked over to her. "You're doing pretty good. You look a lot better." Nicole's eyes twinkled from a face discolored by old bruises. Talking was painful, and her speech difficult to understand, so she nodded stiffly. Justin was caught up in her beauty. However marred, his mind flashed with his last look just before the dog had pounced. Nicole struggled with a few words. Justin took a moment to decipher them. Nicole watched him think. He tilted his head. "Are you trying to thank me?" She blinked positively. "You're welcome," he smiled. "Besides, your daughter has thanked us many times." Justin glanced over her tortured body. "Can I get you something? Water? Food?" She closed her eyes tightly and slowly rose to a very erect stance. Her breaths were short and shallow. A moment later she tried to bend forward. Justin took a step closer. "Can I help?" She looked at him with soft eyes. Justin nodded his head. "You don't want help." With 2 fingers of her right hand, she gestured a walking motion. She had made the effort several times in the last few days. Justin smiled. "I look forward to the day when we can have a conversation." She gave him a quick blink with her eyes. Justin walked away. He passed Michelle and strode from the cave into the light of day. Nicole watched him until he was out of sight. She sighed and took a tortured step. Michelle also watched Justin leave. Her glum expression continued. After he was gone, she spoke in a low tone. "Unsubstantiated optimism. Really." Her arm dangled to the cave soil at the side of her chair, and her fingers found a small stone. She picked it up and tossed it into the canyon. "2 for them, and what's there for me?" Michelle rose out of her chair and walked to the cave entrance. She saw Paul and Shemaine kneeling near a bush. Justin moved toward them. More tears rolled from her eyes, and she kicked the pebbles at her feet. "Things had better get better." She spun around and walked to her chair. A short time later, Paul, huffing, entered the cave. Michelle raised an eyebrow. "What's the matter? Is playtime over?" She got up and marched to the water. "You want some water? What's the problem?" Paul wiped his brow. "Me? What's my problem? I must have missed something." Michelle shook a finger at him. "You know, Paul, you're an ass." She took 2 deep breaths and straightened. "I'm going to help Dad. You seem too busy to help." She marched out of the cave. Paul turned a confused look at Nicole. "What in hell was that?" Nicole moved the only part of her body that didn't cause pain, her eyebrows. Paul glanced around. "Cave fever, that's it. She's flipping out." He went to where a smoke-dried rabbit hung from a stick rammed into a crack in the rock. He tore a leg off and gnawed on it. He stopped chewing and looked at Nicole again. He extended the rabbit leg toward her. "Want some?" Nicole closed her eyes for a short moment. Paul swallowed. "I guess not." Within a few moments he had the meat off the bone. He turned and flung the remains through the cave opening, just as Shemaine came in. The bone whizzed by her head. She smiled. "I'm glad you weren't eating a cow." Paul chuckled. His face reddened, and his eyes sparkled. "11 days produced significant healing. Nicole now took her meals with the others around the fire. She conversed, but haltingly. Still in pain, she socialized for only short periods. For the others, conversations were light and seldom dealt with the past. A branch of green pine crackled in the heat of the fire. An owl hooted in the dark. The chatter among the 5 seemed spent, and Shemaine leaned back, her eyes focused on the ceiling of the cave. She spoke in a dreamy voice. "When we were headed this way, looking for that settlement, we came across this beautiful place. It was a little pond." Justin jumped to his feet and rushed to her side. "A settlement? Did you say you were looking for a settlement?" Shemaine looked up. Justin dropped to one knee and faced her. Shemaine smiled. "Yes, a settlement. But I told you that." "No, you didn't. No, you didn't." He actually jumped into the air, and when he came down, he ran to Michelle. He grabbed both of her hands and pulled her to her feet. I told you. We're close. We're close." Paul stood up. Wait. Let's make sure we're talking about the same thing." He sat next to Shemaine, something he had arranged. "Tell us about this settlement." Justin let go of Michelle and went back to his seat. He sat down and focused on Shemaine. "Tell us." Without hesitation, Shemaine divulged the information in a short statement. "Some strangers came to Ravens in the Sky from the south, just before the big battle. They were going to lead us back there." Nicole leaned forward. "We were told it was the southeast." She swallowed. "On the bank of a sea." Justin leaned his head back. "If I take a deep breath, I'll float into the air like a balloon." In turn, he recounted his family's tale of the dead man and their search to the southeast. The stories fit together perfectly, and a wave of conviction flowed over the group. Michelle's eyes widened. "Dad, the waters we saw from the hilltop, remember? We were trying to figure out how it could be the Gulf. Paul shouted at the cave ceiling, "The new inland sea!" An awesome weight lifted from Justin's shoulders. The settlement does exist. Justin smiled. Tomorrow we celebrate. The next day Justin and Paul rose with the sun. In a lively mood they prepared for a hunt, with hopeful expectations of providing something special for the festivities. In quick order their weapons were in hand, as well as a supply of jerky. The women woke with their movement. Michelle threw a small stick at Paul. "Be careful." The men departed. Michelle turned to Shemaine. "I guess we can clean this place up and get ready for the celebration." They both jumped to their feet and walked to the cave entrance. Michelle shouted, "Bring back a pizza." She smiled at Shemaine. Paul turned and walked a few steps backward. He waved and mumbled softly to himself, "Oh, Shemaine, you boil my blood." Turning away, he took a deep breath and exhaled a low moan. With energetic steps, he swiftly passed Justin. Michelle headed back into the cave. Shemaine continued to observe Paul and whispered to herself, "I know you've been watching me." Paul disappeared into the brush. Shemaine glanced at her deformed arm and headed back into the cave, her eyes sparkling, her mouth grinning. Paul and Justin made their way to the closed end of the canyon and studied the rim of the mesa at its top. In the hot, stagnant air, their sweat flowed profusely, and their shuffling feet sent up puffs of dust particles that stuck to their wet skin. Paul stepped forward. "I see a way." With little difficulty, they ascended the slope to the top, where a fresh breeze of cooler air ruffled their long hair and dried the moisture on their skin. Justin scanned the vista. A fresh growth of grass, bright green, swayed at knee height. Thousands of lavender blossoms spread across the mesa, scenting the air sweetly. Scattered clumps of short, sturdy pine, like misshapen umbrellas, stood in the swaying grass. They rested on one knee, their heads rotating in slow, scanning sweeps. They conversed with eye and hand movements only. Both anticipated staying downwind, which meant skirting the mesa from its north edge. Justin stood and took several strides along the rim. He turned to signal Paul, but Paul wasn't there. He retreated and found his son lying on his back, his arms and legs spread. Justin dropped to one knee and whispered, "What are you doing?" Paul whispered back, "Dad, lie down with me. It's great. The grass is soft, the air cool, and the sky is so blue. It's like looking into the sea." Justin smiled and thought, "Hormones, hormones," and did as requested. "Oh, yeah, look how deep the blue is overhead." Paul whispered, "I really miss music." Time ticked by. They lay there, head to head, the sun low and shaded from their eyes. Justin's eyes narrowed to mere slits with sleepiness. He heard Paul sucking air through his mouth. Justin alerted to the sound of a thump. He held his breath. Thump, thump, thump. Justin smiled. A deer was near. Paul whispered to his father, "That sucker is close." "He sure is." Thump, thump. Paul whispered again, "What do we do?" Justin, still smiling, answered, "We might as well get up before he steps on us." Paul smiled. "On the count of 3, we sit up. 1, 2, 3. They both sat straight up, and their heads spun to face the wind. 15 feet away, a big buck jumped straight up into the air. When it came down, it headed at full speed to the north. The men got to their feet and watched it scamper to the mesa edge. Its rump rose up, and its white tail flickered. The men's smiles transformed to laughter. The animal was soon out of sight, and surely headed off the mesa. Paul hefted his bow. "Think there's another up here?" "Could be. Let's follow the rim." They moved unhurriedly and with caution. Near the spot of the animal's disappearance, the men stopped. After a few moments, Paul pointed down the near cliff-like slope of the mesa. Bounding away on the flat plain, at least 150 feet down, the deer, appearing small, vanished into a thicket. Justin turned to face his son. The new position lessened the noise of the wind, and the man caught a different sound, the unmistakable sound of bees whispered like music. He made a quick survey. On a slope leading to the mesa edge stood a limbless carcass of a once-tall pine. Near its top buzzed the bees. The hulk of wood appeared soft and rotted. Justin pointed. "Sweet stuff!" The honey was even more welcome than fresh meat. Rarely found, this was the first find since entering the southern land. Paul's face lit up. Oh, happy day! With the new quest, silence lost its importance. They ambled over to the tree. The opening to the hive was about 30 feet up the tree, and not having limbs to climb, the only way to procure the honey required cutting the tree down. Paul patted the hulk. "If we cut it down, it's probably going to roll over the edge." Justin dug a piece of wood from the tree with his fingers. "Rotten stuff. We'll need the axe and the cable, and something to hold the honey." Paul's eyes brightened. "You wait here, Dad. I'll get the stuff. No need for both of us to go." Paul scanned the many blue flowers swaying in the cool breeze. Justin, delighted, sat down. "Okay, I'll wait here." The young man departed, and Justin scooted to a softer spot of grass. He reclined on his back and again dove into the blue gaseous sea above. He lay listening to the clicking of grasshopper wings and watched 2 vultures circle high on a rising column of air. Justin's mind swam in the pleasant state of things. The settlement existed. Tonight they would have honey for the celebration. His mind took a dreamy turn, and silly, bizarre things floated. Justin's eyes opened when a shadow crossed his face. Paul was back. He rose to a sitting position and looked at his son. He jumped to his feet, though much too quickly. His mind still hazy, he stumbled a trifle on the slope. As his father stood up, Paul sat down to catch his breath. "The women really flipped when I told them about the honey." He had a big smile on his face. "I picked some flowers for Shemaine." He smiled. "She gave me a kiss." Justin stared down at him. "Well, shiver me timbers." He smiled. "The power of honey never ceases to amaze me."